Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I run through the current status of my sermon for this week. When I was a kid, grew up, and Muhammad Ali was on TV. And this is a very famous fight between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman. And Muhammad Ali would do this weird thing that I never understood. He would call the rope-a-dope. And he'd be back against the ropes, and George Foreman was hitting him and hitting him and hitting him and hitting him. And Muhammad Ali just seemed to go round after round doing this. And then at the end of the fight, Muhammad Ali would knock him out. And it's like, what kind of a strategy is this? Let's turn the page. Now, as a pastor, one of the things that I see often is the problem of pain. That we look at this world and we think, surely no one with any intentionality would have made a world that has pain like this. And part of what has happened in terms of people's thinking about God is that if God is out there looking in, then surely he would be intervening and preventing seemingly pointless things from happening. I was watching a video of Nathan Jacobs talking with people who had given up on the Christian religion, and one of them had an uncle who had died in a fire, and the uncle had gone to bed, was smoking in bed, and then fell asleep, and the cigarette lit the mattress, and he died. And the argument was that surely a loving God would have somehow materialized in the room, reached in, and put the cigarette in the ashtray, and the uncle would have lived. So we have all these kinds of things that happen, and we don't quite know what to do with them. So let's assume, for the sake of the argument, that Jesus is God, and questions about his limitations of knowledge and incarnation are always big debates. Wouldn't it have been good for Jesus to come into the first century and teach the germ theory? So tell people, no, wash your hands for ceremonial reasons. The disciples didn't even do that. We read that passage a few months ago. But there's these things you can't see called germs, and so if you just wash your hands, then you won't get sick as much. And let's have sanitation. The Romans were doing some of this, but let's not drink out of lead pipes, and let's make sure that human waste goes someplace and we keep our water uncontaminated. Surely Jesus could have done a much better job in terms of alleviating human suffering and disease than going around doing random miracles. And why not invent penicillin? Give a society a miracle or a fish, and it'll eat for today and live for today, but give them penicillin and, well, everything would go well. So why didn't Jesus give them penicillin? And then there's the problem of the Apostle Paul and time, which I've made this point in a number of times and places, that here we have the Apostle Paul, and he's living, about the same time as Jesus, and surely he could have, met Jesus in person, but we don't have any record of the Apostle Paul ever meeting Jesus in person, which is quite interesting. Surely, maybe, just if Jesus would know what was coming down the road, make sure he bumps into Paul and tell him a thing of two. Well, nothing like that happened. And then Paul is there consenting to the stoning of Stephen in the book of Acts, which is maybe 10 years. I haven't studied the book of Acts for a while, but which is a little bit after, the events that you find in the Gospels. And the heavens open and Stephen sees into the heavens, but Paul doesn't see anything. And then he goes and hunts down people that love Jesus. And then he appears to Paul on the road to Damascus, and Paul is converted. Now, surely many of those people whose friends and relatives were hunted down by Paul would say, Lord, what's with the timing issue? Couldn't you have headed this off at the pass, and Paul wouldn't have done those things? But God doesn't do this. Now, of course, this seems to lead to arguments about God being, not there, and that the world is simply random, and there is no intelligence in charge of history, and we just bumble around and bad things happen. But when people make those arguments as a way of, we're gonna not believe in Christianity anymore, I think, well, how is that an upgrade? Okay, so bad things happen that you can't explain. Now you just say bad things happen that are unexplainable. Does that make better sense for you? Does that improve the world for you? Bad things are still happening at the same rate, except in this way, bad things are meaningless. Now, one of the things that we're going to see in this passage is the seeming impotence as process. Here's a this is a GIF actually that goes on. This is a rather famous picture in my family. This was taken a number of years ago, and these are three of my children, and I have two daughters, and my youngest of two daughters is playing a computer game, and she's 2 years younger than her older sister, and her older sister was just managing quite fine on this computer game. And obviously, when you're this age, the developmental gap of 2 years can be pretty substantial, and her younger sister is just not managing this computer game, and she's so frustrated, and why won't this thing work? And she's just so mad and angry, and there her mother sits behind her. Her mother doesn't reach over and take the mouse. Her mother doesn't fix the situation. The mother just sits there, holds her, and watches her suffer. Surely a good mother would just play the computer game for her child, wouldn't she? Now we're going to have another miracle story in the Gospel of Mark, and it comes outside of a town named Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. Now, Bethsaida is quite likely a place where some of Jesus' disciples lived. But in the Gospel of Matthew, Bethsaida comes in for special notice, especially with respect to miracles. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the deeds of power done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I tell you, on the day of judgment it will be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon than for you. And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heavens? There's another place where Jesus and the disciples lived. No, you'll be brought down to Hades. For if the deeds of power done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. But I tell you that on the day of judgment it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom than for you. What's Jesus saying? Jesus is making a very strange point here, where he's actually saying that these cities that had suffered catastrophe, and therefore with the theodicy of Job, not the book of Job, but of Job's friends, the theodicy of Job's friends should have been the world's most notorious sinners, were actually moral superiors to the friends and neighbors of Jesus. Because apparently seeing miracles, what we imagine would somehow realign our thought about believing in God. We think, well, if God did a miracle in front of us, then we would believe, and then everything would be okay. Jesus says, no, that's not at all how our hearts work. And Bethsaida comes in for special mention here. And again, if we go back here, what we see is a group of people. Jesus goes back to Bethsaida, and they're all excited. Here's a blind man, Jesus. Heal him, touch him, and fix him. We want to watch this. So what does Jesus do? Well, one of the things you'll notice about this story is it's all about hands and seeing. And so Jesus took him by the hand, and the Greek is fairly vivid here. He kind of grabs him, and he leads him out of the village of Bethsaida. And well, why are you doing this, Jesus? Surely you did miracles there. That's what we know that you did. But why are you taking him outside the village? Why are you getting him out of the melee, probably of the marketplace, where this blind man was likely begging? A little bit later, we'll figure out that he probably isn't from there. He just came there because that's where the population is, and that's where he'll get the best pickings. And so Jesus is back now, and here's a new blind man, and fix this one too. Then maybe Jesus should have, opened a glasses factory for people. Well, and then the saliva business we talked a little about with the hearing. And if you remember a couple Sundays ago when Jesus healed someone who was deaf, he put saliva in, and saliva was imagined to have curative powers. And so he put saliva on his eyes. Well, actually, he spit in his eyes, some of the other translations say. And he laid hands on him, and he asked him, "Can you see?" Now, I'm putting a little bit of Greek into the text here because what we see are all these words for see in this passage. Now, and the man, now if you go to different translations, you're going to see lots of different renderings of some of these words here, because what essentially happens is that we're putting prefixes upon some of these Greek verbs. And the man on a blepo, he looked up, or his sight was restored. It's ambiguous. This is the same ambiguity, by the way, that's in John 3 between born from above and born again, a wordplay that the Gospel of John very much plays into. And if you want to see those, you can go to my my separate church channel, I do my sermon and Sunday school videos there, and I've been going through the Gospel of John in the Sunday school class, little commercial in the middle of my rough draft. And he said, I can see people, but they look like trees walking. So was his sight restored? But it wasn't totally restored. And he kind of looks up. And why all the playing around with the Greek verbs here about seeing, Mark? What's going on here? And this business about seeing people, but they look like trees when he's looking up, is there something going on? I'm not going to try to pierce that imagery and that symbolism in this. Could there be something to it? I don't know. I don't have an answer for it today. One of the things when you learn Greek is that one of the easy way to remember prepositions in Greek is to kind of imagine them spatially. So dia is through, and eis is into, and en is in, and apos is towards, and apo is away from, and kata is down, and upo is under, and ana is up, and uper is above, and peri is around, and they have the genitives and the datives and accusative. You learn all this stuff when you learn Greek. One of the things that I remind people, I do a lot more of this kind of thing in my adult Sunday school class, is that when we look at ancient manuscripts that we construct these modern edited versions of the Bible from that you buy on Amazon, or if you can actually find a Bible bookstore these days, one of the things that you notice is that it's just all letters run together. And you can perhaps decipher the little letters that I put on the side here if you want, because I didn't get rid of all the caps, but took out the caps and took out the punctuation and took out the spaces. And what you'll notice is that even with line breaks, you can decipher it fairly easily. And so ancient people read this. You don't think about the fact that word spacing is actually a technology, as is punctuation and a whole number of other things that came later. But this was the text that they were using. And when you think about all those prepositions, and when you think about verbs, well, prepositions and verbs kind of came together. And prepositions are sort of prefixes with a bunch of Greek verbs. And so here we have to see, which is blepo, which is in a sense the root here. And we have anablepo and enblepo and periblepo and diablepo and epiblepo and anablepo and apoblepo. We take all of these prepositions and we put them on nouns, and well, you can see around, you can see into, you can see through, you can see up, or you can see again. And that's why anablepo is both regain sight, see again, or look up. But then why is Mark playing with these verbs like he is? Surely you could tell the story in a different way. And then something's about to happen, because usually when Jesus does a miracle, he stands up and stills the storm. We don't have him stilling the storm, and then the wind, dies down a little bit. Then Jesus yells again, and it's kind of like reminding a kid for dinner. But that's usually not how Jesus' miracles go. What's going on with this miracle? This is a very strange story. It's got all these elements that, well, on one hand, they seem to say, probably an eyewitness told the story, because it has all of these extra details, and the Gospel of Mark is full of that. But then there's this strangeness about this. So Jesus spits in the guy's eyes and puts his hands on him, and he only seems to be healed halfway, either looking up or seeing again or not seeing again. The man apparently wasn't born blind. And Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked, this time diablepo, and his sight was restored. There's another preposition for you. And the verb very much is restored. And so the implication is that the man used to be able to see and lost his sight. And so maybe Jesus should bring glaucoma surgery or eyeglasses or something. And notice, Mark is perfectly capable of using the root for the verb. So then Jesus laid his hands on him again, and he looked, and diablepo, and his sight was restored. And he saw, blepo, everything clearly. And now what's interesting is that there's this progression in the verbs of anablepo, to look again or to look up, which is what Jesus did if you go back to the feeding of the 5,000, when he looks up to heaven. And we find Jesus looking up to heaven and sighing when he heals another man. And diablepo, and he's looking through, and then he sees in. Now, people have been writing about this parable for a very long time, and Jerome, back around 600, had a homily, and it's so much fun to look back at old sermons as texts like this, because ancient people saw very different things in the text than we do today, and it just helps us see that we read these texts with our own eyes and our own filters. And almost everyone, even in contemporary commentators, going all the way back to Jerome, says part of this story is about the blindness of the disciples. A lot of people believe that. Jerome makes the point that Bethsaida is the house of the disciples. Why would the place of the disciples? Bethsaida is basically the house of fish, just like Bethlehem is the house of bread, and the disciples were fishermen, and so it was kind of a regional center where fish was bought and sold, and this is the place of the disciples, and they don't see Jesus very well. And we just had a story where Jesus talked about eyes to see and ears to hear, and the disciples seeming to be blind and deaf to the message that Jesus is getting. And in that passage a while ago, we read Isaiah 35, and this story about when the Lord comes back and redeems his people, the blind will see, and the deaf will hear, and the mute will speak, and the lame will dance, and the trees of the field will clap their hands. And it seems all of these elements seem to get pulled into this story. And so forever people reading this story have thought, what point is Jesus making? And what point is the Gospel of Mark making with all this imagery? And in fact, the next passage in the story will be Peter's blindness to Jesus' mission, where Jesus calls him Satan. But then there's this strange two-stage miracle. And contemporary commentators usually see this as limitation and difficulty. People today have a hard time imagining Jesus being God, but easily imagine him being human. Ancients believed just the opposite. Ancient commentators saw process. Ancient commentators, well, it's easy for a man to be God, to do all those things, but to be actually human, well, Greeks were skeptical about that. Now, the story ends, and Jesus sends him home, which is clearly not in the village, and says, don't even go to the village. Well, what's he saying to him? Give up your begging. Go home, and your life is restored. No more begging. Be free. And sends him away. And you imagine the people of the village kind of wondering, well, they saw a miracle, and they saw him leave, but they didn't get the show in the marketplace, and what's going to happen? Jesus turns him away from that life and sends him back home. Now, here we are in this world, and bad things happen, and we don't know why, and it might be just our frustration of being a child and playing a computer game, and God seeming to tolerate all of this misery. And even in stories from the Bible where it would seem, a little bit of timing, and maybe all the people, killed or imprisoned by Saul would have been let free. I mean, come on, Lord. Can't you be a little bit more considerate about our feelings? And I wonder, when you look at the crucifixion, and I think about Muhammad Ali's rope-a-dope, and I think, well, why would God do this? Well, here's the thing that you can no longer say about God, that he excluded himself from the privilege, from the common suffering and frustration that we have. And perhaps what we see on the cross is a sort of cruciform rope-a-dope at Jesus' expense, where there's a kangaroo trial, and it seems perfectly obvious that Jesus could have avoided execution, but he doesn't. And when he's on the cross, they mock him. He saved others, but he can't save himself. And of course, it's farthest from their minds that maybe he's saving others by not saving himself. And of course, Easter then comes, and the whole story looks different. So what should we take away from this story? I think there's a process of gratitude. Now, of course, we might imagine ourselves sitting here and our Heavenly Father sitting behind us and watching us suffer, and others looking on, just kind of wondering and thinking, well, maybe they should do better, or too bad that happened to them, or isn't Shouldn't life be good and easy and pleasant? But then we learn from the cross that God himself understands perfectly well. My God, Jesus says from the cross, why have you forsaken me? So how should we live? Maybe we should live within a process of gratitude. Maybe we need to look again. Maybe we need to look up. Maybe we need to look through. And maybe we need to see in. This seems to be exactly the process that Jesus brings this man through. He looks up, not quite clear. He looks again. Then he looks through, and finally he sees in. I think a good bit of that is what the Christian life is about, even in the midst of suffering.